This is TLV1.
Hi, this is Gilad.
And Dahlia.
Before we start the show, we want to let you know about a very special event that will be taking place in London. That's for all of our UK listeners, and we know who you are. On the 6th of December, we'll be holding a live event where we'll be interviewing the acclaimed journalist Ian Black, the former Middle East editor for The Guardian. We'll be speaking about his new book entitled Enemies and Neighbours, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel, 1917 to 2017.
The event will take place at City University at 6 p.m. It's a free event. Please join us. Check out our Facebook page for updates. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel. We look forward to seeing you.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern, and every week my co-host Dahlia Shendin and I talk about books and research and other related stuff, but not today because Dahlia is away and will be back with us shortly, so it's just me. My guest today is a sociologist at Goldsmith University in London. He is the author of the new book, Contemporary Left Antisemitism, that was recently published by Routledge. Dr. David Hirsh, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good morning.
So what are really the features of contemporary antisemitism on the left, and how does it differ from the classic antisemitism that has traditionally been the mainstay of the right?
Okay, well, I would already begin by questioning your premise, of course, because I'm an academic. So I don't think there is a classic anti-Semitism. There are a number of distinct manifestations of anti-Semitism throughout history: Christian, modernist, nationalist, anti-nationalist, Stalinist. And I think that the anti-Semitism that we're seeing at the moment, which is becoming more and more mainstream on the left, my book is really a story of the mainstreaming of this stuff from a kind of far left periphery into the mainstream. And what we're looking at is really, I think, a way in which Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the issue of anti-Semitism becomes absolutely central to the way in which people construct their own political identities in some parts of Britain and some parts of Europe and America. By some parts, what I mean is it's largely a phenomenon of the intellectuals and the political left. And that doesn't mean all intellectuals and all of the political left, but it's a phenomenon which has become much more mainstream in those worlds than it was. So, firstly, the centrality. Let me give you a story, actually. At Goldsmiths, we have a welcome meeting for first-year students. And a couple of years ago, I remember very well, the guy from the Students' Union came in to speak. And he said, we run political campaigns. We run 3 campaigns. One against fascism, one against student fees, and one against the occupation. And this is in London. And I'm looking around the room and I'm wondering, how does everybody know which occupation we're talking about? And why does nobody ask why this occupation? And it became clear to me at that moment that something interesting was going on, because on the one hand, a campaign against the occupation is entirely legitimate. You know, if you have a campaign against the occupation, I'm very happy to join it. But what was happening here was the political identity of students who were coming to college was being formed around this issue. And nobody seemed even to be questioning or to be wondering why or how or what the effect of this would be. So one of the phenomena we're seeing is that the Israel-Palestine conflict and the role, in particularly of Jews within it, is becoming a symbolic issue, and it's becoming symbolic of a whole worldview. And it's becoming symbolic, actually Israel becomes symbolic of a whole global system of imperialism or capitalism or modernity in people's political identity.
Okay, but why is it anti-Semitic?
Well, so that first point, this isn't in itself anti-Semitic, but all anti-Semitisms have constructed the Jews as being central to everything that is bad in the world. And the construction of Israel as being at the very keystone of a global system of oppression is already very close to that discourse. There are other reasons too.
Is that a new phenomenon?
It's not a new phenomenon. The particular way in which a kind of irrational hostility to Israel emerges out of a democratic discourse of criticism and becomes something new, is not new. It comes from the Soviet propaganda and it comes from East Germany and Poland in 1968. And then it's something that was adopted partly by the New Left in the early 70s. But what's new now is that it's mainstreaming. So when I was a student in the 80s, we were fighting against people who said that Jewish societies on campus were Zionist and were therefore racist and therefore should be prohibited. But this was a little weird corner of the left. Now it's a discourse which is in some ways taken leadership of the National Union of Students and the unions and the Labour Party.
Now, as in the last decade or so?
No, well, the last decade or so, but actually the last year or two.
Oh, okay, so very recent.
Very recently.
So how do you account for that? Why is it happening?
I don't know why it's happening. My experience for the last 15 years or so was that boycott academics came into my campus and into my union in 2003, and it became quite a big issue in my union. And we were always worried not only about the specific thing of excluding Israelis from our campus, but about the knock-on effect of how that made people relate to Jews on our campus and to people who opposed some of the hostility that came with it, and also what it brought into the union. There are lots of ways in which this kind of hostility may become anti-Semitic. One is the effect on Jews who are accused of being part of this global defense of the Israeli state. So there's a general accusation or a presumption of bad faith, right? The standard response, if I raise an issue about BDS and I say there's an issue connecting BDS to anti-Semitism, the standard response isn't to say, well, I think you've made a misjudgment there, I think you've misread the evidence, I think you've got it slightly wrong. The standard response is to say, you're only saying that in order to silence criticism of Israel, in order to silence the cry of the oppressed, the Palestinians. And there's a presumption of bad faith, a presumption of that you're lying. And it's really pernicious because that becomes a kind of really relentless mode of bullying. If people speak against anti-Semitism or if people speak against the demonization of Israel, then they're not accepted as part of a community of rational discussion. They're actually cast out of the community of rational discussion via this formulation which says you're only saying that in bad faith as part of a conspiracy in order to silence criticism.
That you call in your book the Livingston formulation.
That's correct.
After Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London and a bulwark of the Labour Party for 50 years or so, who has recently been kicked out of the Labour Party.
No, he hasn't been kicked out. He's been simply banned from standing for public office for 2 years.
Right. Okay.
He's a member in good standing, even though he came out with a whole set of tirades. He claimed that Hitler was supporting Zionism. He said until he went mad. He said that the Nazis were selling Mauser pistols to the Zionists. He said that the Zionists went to Hitler in the 30s and demanded that Hitler should prohibit sermons being made in Yiddish in synagogues and that he should force them to make them in Hebrew. So Livingston went with all this really crazy stuff. And the reason he does it is because he wants people to understand. He wants to educate young people to believe that Nazism and Zionism are similar. That the people who wanted to murder the Jews are similar to the people who wanted to save the Jews or to create some kind of Jewish nationalist fight back.
But it strikes me more as lowbrow idiocy than anti-Semitism proper, as hatred proper.
Oh, well, lots of racism is certainly lowbrow idiocy, but it's not lowbrow idiocy. Hannah Arendt talked about a relationship between the elite and the mob, and a lot of this comes from the elite. A lot of this comes from the intellectuals and the academics and from the leading politicians. So Ken Livingstone isn't an idiot by any means. He's somebody who's been involved in mainstream Labour politics for years. People think of him as the kind of natural mayor of London. And he adopted he comes from a political tradition where this politics is normal. But that tradition was very small in the 80s. It was a kind of small band of anti-Zionist Jews and people like Lenny Brenner and Ken Loach. And what's happened in the last couple of years is that it's really come into the mainstream.
Okay. Before we go back to that question, because I think this is really the crux of the question, the mainstreaming of that discourse, I'd like to stay a bit longer on what you just mentioned now, anti-Zionist Jews.
Yes.
Who play a role that you see as pernicious, and you dedicate one of the chapters in your book to them, especially
Yes.
them, anti-Zionist Jews, as promoting and in many ways whitewashing the problem that you're talking about.
I think it's really quite simple to understand, actually. It's not complicated. Many Jews around the world have a particular relationship to Israel, a particular interest in Israel, and I well understand that. Many Jews around the world have a particular relationship to what Israel does wrong. And I well understand that, and actually I share it. But what sometimes happens is that people build a whole political identity, especially Jews build a whole political identity around opposing the occupation and opposing what Israel does wrong, and they de-rationalize it, and then they take it into civil society. So they take their Jewish obsession with the crimes of Israel, real and imagined, and then they argue that a trade union or a church or a Labour Party should adopt the same Jewish obsession. And when the Labour Party adopts a focus, when it constructs its own identity around the crimes of Israel, in the same way that a Jewish anti-Zionist might, then you have a different thing going on. I think Israeli anti-Zionists, for example, I think the Israeli left suffered a kind of real genuine defeat in 2001 after what may turn out to have been the end of the peace process. And I think they found it really difficult to deal with that. And I mean, I think quite rightly, actually, the Israeli left had its day-to-day focus in opposing the Israeli government, and I can understand that. And they stuck to this principle that the main enemy is at home. Our main enemy is the Israeli government. And then they had this wish to go out into global civil society and global academia, and they took this with them and they said the main enemy is at home. And everybody else said, yeah, I think you're right, the main enemy is in Israel. And then there's a slippage. There's a slippage from a kind of particular Jewish concern, which is understandable, into, again, this pushing of Israel and Palestine and the conflict right into the center of political consciousness as a symbol of everything that's bad in the world. And then it becomes something new.
Okay, but I mean, it's not unique in history. If you look back on anti-Americanism, for example, people on the left have accused America for all the wrongs and ills of the world. And if a student leader came into a lecture theatre and spoke about the war in the 1960s, people would probably assume that it's the Vietnam War. It was a rallying cry for progressive students just the same. But I think that your analysis of how it relates to Israel feels that there's more to it, in, as you said, in bad faith. It's not just perhaps a disingenuous political cause. It's more than that. Am I reading you right?
So it's true that anti-Americanism is also a thing, and I think it has a relationship to this kind of hostility to Israel. I think the focus on America is also a key evil, the great Satan and the little Satan, I think is problematic. But I think both of them reflect this idea that, so the idea is you need to keep your eye on the ball. The idea is that the real structure of power, the real thing that hurts people across the world is this global system of imperialism or capitalism or modernity. And people sometimes center it on the idea of America as being the central manifestation of that. So that's one problem, right? Marx, for example, had a completely different view, right? Marx said that I begin my lecture on Marx for our first years by telling them that Marx adored capitalism, right? Marx thought capitalism was brilliant, dynamic. It created the productive forces and technology which made all sorts of things possible. It created cities, it created civilization, it created rights and law and a democratic state, and it created a situation where we could move beyond. And all of the serious philosophers of modernity have had this dialectic of modernity, that modernity is both freedom and also slavery. But if you move that on to a one-sided binary where you say imperialism is just bad and just evil, and then everybody who's against imperialism is good, then you have a whole different politics. But then there's one step further, which is...
But is there anyone saying that imperialism is good?
No. To characterize this whole global system, of how the world works, right? Which some people call it modernity, for example. Is modernity good? Well, modernity is really great, but it also has a really dark and frightening side. Mm-hmm. So that's one question. But the second question is, how does it get symbolized through Israel? Through this little tiny state in the Middle East, which is involved in an ongoing, nasty but rather small conflict with its neighbour over land, right? Why does this global issue get symbolised around Israel? And not only why, but what is the effect? What is the effect of socialising young people into politics, into a global worldview at which the evils of Zionism is at the very centre? Now, you're right. That has happened with America. It's also happened, for example, with South Africa in the 1980s. And I think there were issues with those two things that we could discuss, but there's a further virulence and a further potential for anti-Semitism which isn't contained within those other two. There is a long tradition of authentically left-wing anti-Semitism, going back to Bruno Bauer and Bakunin, and when August Bebel talked about the socialism of fools. There's always been a temptation by people on the left who look at the world and they find that the world kind of looks like a conspiracy, and there's been a temptation to take this shortcut of blaming the Jews. And if you look at the history of, structural accounts of how the world works, sociology, Marxism, these were ways of explaining why the world looks a bit like a conspiracy, but it isn't one. So anti-Semitism has always been there as a temptation, specifically on the left. And the left has always had this sort of fight within itself between people who were attracted by what Moishe Postone calls a fetishized form of oppositional consciousness on the one hand, and more kind of scientific, rational forms of oppositional consciousness on the other. The left, we know for many, many decades has been sort of split between the people who are attracted by totalitarian politics and Stalinism and the Soviet Union and China and Mao and the rest of it, and then a more libertarian, egalitarian, democratic left opposition. So this is absolutely not about the failings of the left, and the left is anti-Semitic. This is a worry about a particular form of left-wing politics, which has been coming into the mainstream and which the democratic forces are having trouble dealing with.
Exactly. No, so it is an indictment of the left after all, because the democratic forces within the left are losing. And therefore, I'm trying to understand what is it that over the last couple of years made who were up until then right-thinking, democratic left-wingers, progressive in the basic sense of the word, buy into all these ideas, because that's what mainstreaming is all about. Is the leaders of the unions, Jeremy Corbyn and his circles, have been there, as you said, for a long time. It's just that
Correct.
now
Jeremy Corbyn has been unmoved for 5 decades.
Exactly.
He's been supporting the Soviet Union, and he's been working for the Iranian TV station.
But he didn't come out of nowhere.
Visiting
That's what I mean.
Gaza and hanging out with Hamas. Jeremy Corbyn is unmoved, but you're right.
No, but also physically, he's been a member of parliament for 35 years now, right? So it didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like a brand new phenomenon in this sense. It's just that he's won over a large amount of who were up until then right-thinking, rational, progressive, democratic left-wingers.
Well,
How did that happen?
I don't know if it was so utopian as you say, but it's true that Corbyn used to be, he's been there, but he's been unimportant. Suddenly he became important. But we've seen this also on the right. I mean, one of the things we're seeing is that people on the left are suddenly becoming quite sophisticated in spotting and understanding right-wing anti-Semitism, with the rise of Trump, with Trump's connections to Steve Bannon and to far-right politics. Suddenly the left is catching on to quite complicated ways of understanding people like Bannon and Trump who aren't anti-Semitic, who don't seem to be anti-Semitic, who don't hate Jews, but they have a connection to far-right and anti-Semitic politics. So the people on the left are suddenly becoming wise to this process on the right, and people on the right are suddenly becoming wise to this issue on the left, and everybody's pointing at the other and saying, look, the real problem is over there. And the left says, no, the real problem is over there with Trump. And the right says, no, the real problem is over there with the Islamists and with Corbyn and with the left and their licensing and normalising of anti-Semitism. But hang on. But if everybody only sees anti-Semitism within a community that they hate anyway, then we have a problem. My book is about anti-Semitism within actually my own political and intellectual family. And I think people need to start by getting their own house in order.
All right. What is your take on the overlap between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Because a lot of the anti-Semitism that you discuss, as you say openly, is about Israel, whereas the different other kinds of anti-Semitism, the old kind, or however you want to call it, wasn't really about Israel.
No.
It was just an essentialist view of the Jews. The anti-Semitism on the left assumes an inextricable link between the Jews in general, those in Britain or elsewhere, and the state of Israel, which is something that also many Jews subscribe to.
Correct.
So it's not really about their obsession with Israel. It's really how they project it on Jewry as a concept, as a universal
I think that's a form of appearance of anti-Semitism, right? There was a big issue recently about Moshe Machover, who was an Israeli leftist, actually, who's been in London for a long time. So Machover puts out a leaflet around Labour Party conference, and he says the people who are pretending that there's anti-Semitism in the Labour Party are really doing nothing else other than trying to smear the left. And this is an organised campaign run from Jerusalem and run from the right wing in America. So immediately what he does is he takes Labour people who oppose anti-Semitism, many of whom are Jews, and he says, these people do not belong here. These people are actually agents of a foreign apartheid, racist Nazi state, or they're basically agents of the Trumpist right. And this is the kind of way in which there's a real impact against Jews. So this is one of the forms of appearance of anti-Semitism. There are many others. There are qualitative forms of appearance. So sometimes you get that there's quite often a slippage through. So in the Israel-Palestine conflict, bad things happen. People who are under the age of 18 get killed in the conflict. Many of them are Palestinians, right? This is true. There's a slippage between that actual situation and the characterization of Israel as a child-killing state, which is often illustrated with blood and bloodthirst and those kinds of images. The idea of child-killing is really problematic. So we start with something real and we mystify it into a language and a narrative of anti-Semitism, of child murdering or of conspiracy, which comes through the terminology of Zionist lobby and Israel lobby and stuff like that. So that's another way. One of the ways is the presumption of bad faith against Jews. The other way is when tropes come, when actual things become mystified into the language of anti-Semitism. There are other things too. I remember being told that the reason we were opposing BDS within the union was because of the Talmud. And the Talmud says that the Jews are the chosen people and the Jews think they're better than everybody else. And that's how it works. So the political question got mystified into a religious question. So there are lots of different ways in which anti-Semitism kind of leaks around the edges of this irrational and huge hostility and centering of Israel as the key political issue on the planet, and particularly for people in Britain.
You quoted many famous people. I'm going to quote one now, Jean-Paul Sartre, who famously said that anti-Semitism is not an opinion, it's a crime, however you look at it. And on this note, I'd like to ask you whether you think that there are any benign forms of anti-Zionism that won't slip into anti-Semitism.
I understand that. I think the way to think about anti-Zionism, certainly for me as a sociologist, is to look at what happens when it becomes realised in a social movement. So we could have a philosophical discussion about universalism and particularism and critiques of this and that. But what I do in the book is to look at what happens to anti-Zionism when it actually becomes real within a movement, when it comes into a trade union, when it goes into a church, when it comes into a political party. So it's an empirical question. It's not a philosophical question. We sit in a basement in Tel Aviv and say, well, you know, an anti-racist form of anti-Zionism might be possible. It's not a philosophical question. It's an empirical question. And empirically, I think I show in the book that when anti-Zionism gets a foothold and becomes popular and normal and legitimate, it brings anti-Semitism with it.
So that form, the benign form of anti-Zionism, do you think it has a place within the Labour Party, within the left?
Look, it depends.
Can you argue for it? I mean, it could be, at the end of the day, a bridge.
It depends also what you mean by anti-Zionism. If you create an ism, you create a worldview out of the idea that Israel should cease to exist, then I think that's already really weird. I mean, if you had an anti-Italy-ism and you socialised students in London to think that Italy was the central evil on the planet, already that would seem really weird, right? And I think anti-Zionism is kind of similar to that. But of course, many people don't, have a very fuzzy, very hazy idea of what they're talking about anyway. So, I think people are quite right to be critical of things that the Israeli government does and says, and some people who are critical in that way construct themselves as anti-Zionist. I don't want to fight everything about words. What I want to do is to look at the reality of a social movement and to see what actually happens. And that's why the book is a lot about case study. It's a lot of stories about how things actually work, not how things might work in my head, but how things actually work when they become normal, when the temperature rises, when there's a fight. That's what I'm interested in looking, and that's one of the easy ways in. I mean, there are much harder ways in, right? So I think one had to understand the centrality and the attraction of Israel as a symbolic way of defining your identity. I think you have to also understand there's a history of Christians defining themselves in relation to Jews and defining their identity in relation to Jews, and it's a long history. But that's much harder to look at empirically. It's much harder to look at empirically about how underlying anti-Semitic attitudes, even if they're unconscious, might feed into a kind of wish to centre your life on Israel. Abraham de Swan is a Dutch sociologist, and he talks about a kind of over-enthusiasm. He says that many people felt kind of prohibited from being critical of Jews, and after the Holocaust, and especially in Dutch society, the country of Anne Frank. And he says people felt that their mouth was kind of closed. And then when eventually 4 or 5 decades later there came an opportunity to be angry with Israel, de Swan says that this kind of manifested itself in a kind of quite an emotional way, that it was like the letting off of steam of a pressure cooker. One can come up with many ideas and models and theories. The most important, I think, is the one that I said, is to look at and to see how it manifests itself.
Okay, so let's look at one concrete phenomenon, not just an idea, but something that, is actually a campaign, and that is BDS, or the boycott movement. It is, after all, you can look at it as a non-violent form of protest, making a political point against Israel that is, as I said, non-violent. We're not talking about destruction or elimination or anything of the sort. Yet you still think it feeds into that mystification of Israel.
I think there are two ways that people in Britain can think about the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? And it's actually quite straightforward. You can embrace a politics of peace. You can say we want to make solidarity with the people who are fighting for peace and with the people in both Israel and in Palestine who are opposing war and who are opposing Islamophobia and racism and anti-Semitism. And you can say we want to make solidarity with the unions and with people like ourselves and with academics in both Israel and in Palestine, and with a certain modesty. We can't fix the Israel-Palestine conflict from London, but we can maybe do some good and help. So one idea is the politics of peace. The other, and you get this on both sides, is that people say, no, we don't want peace, we want victory. And you have some people who wave an Israeli flag and say Israel is good and the Palestinians are bad and we want Israel, we support Israel, and that's it. And other people wave the Palestinian flag and they say, we don't want peace, we want Palestine, we want the Palestinians to win their rights and to defeat the evil. And it seems to me that the politics of peace is really my left tradition, and the flag waving of one side against the other is not. It's about getting inside both of the nations, inside Israel, inside Palestine, and really relating to human beings and to social movements. And it's also about the nature of solidarity. Solidarity isn't just excluding people from our campuses kind of arbitrarily. Solidarity is about really hard work of making links, making contacts, learning the language, speaking to people, going to the Palestinian territories or to Israel and teaching and interacting. And that's what solidarity is about.
But that politics, for many people, has discredited itself. Look at, for example, Obama's peace efforts in Israel. He was constantly trying to hug Netanyahu into concessions. Sure. And it backfired. So people look at it and say, this solidarity and peace strategy on both sides has failed. We have to take it to the next step. And it's not so much, perhaps, a paradigm shift, turning from a peace strategy to a victory strategy, but saying, okay, perhaps applying pressure would take us back to the peace strategy.
Well, BDS is very clear about being ambivalent about whether it's for two states or whether it's for the elimination of Israel. So it maintains, for example, its rhetoric on the right of the Palestinians to return is kept vague in order to keep a coalition together between people who are eliminationist of Israel, people who believe that Israel should declare itself to not exist anymore, but they know that that won't happen. So it's a policy of hoping for the conquest of Israel, but they want to be in a coalition with people who don't really quite understand that or who don't understand the consequences of that. So, the very idea that Israel is oppressive within the West Bank, but within the whole of the Middle East, Israel is a small minority. The idea that it's irrational for Israelis to want the possibility and the right of self-defense is not well understood. We've seen recently what happens to minorities in the Middle East who don't have the possibility of self-defense, people who rely on the international community to come and save them. The Yazidis ended up on a mountainside being, starved out and frozen out and sold into slavery, right? Minorities need the possibility of self-defense. And I think that BDS has no understanding of that. I don't think BDS is non-violent. I think BDS is a kind of flag waving for one side against the other, when what it should be doing, you said Obama tried to hug Netanyahu into peace, but we don't try to hug Netanyahu, or we don't try to hug Hamas like Corbyn does. What we do is we try to hug the people who are fighting for peace and who are fighting against racism and who are fighting for human rights. And that involves going inside nation states. The left has always been for the self-liberation of the oppressed within every nation state, not for picking one flag to wave and to cheer it on in battle against the other.
Do you see an imminent backlash within left-wing circles, more progressive, more democratic wings coming back?
I don't know what's going to happen. This fight is not over. The Labour Party is not dead yet, although it's really worrying. Things happen today that couldn't have happened 2 years ago. Things happened 2 years ago that couldn't have happened 2 years before that.
And Corbyn has been politically successful.
Well, relatively. I mean,
more than his predecessors.
No, well, it depends how you measure it. But, Miliband lost the election and immediately resigned. Corbyn lost the election and said that he'd won. The struggle is not over. There are many, many people, in Britain and in Holland and in France and in America who support democratic politics. But there are big, serious threats to the ideas and the concepts and the practice of democratic politics, both from the populist right, from the Trumpists, from the Brexiters, and from the Corbynites. And actually, these three populist movements have quite a lot in common. And it's not over yet. But I'm certainly worried. And as I said, the book is a story of mainstreaming, and the mainstreaming hasn't been turned around yet.
All right. Dr. David Hirsh, you're a sociologist at Goldsmith's University of London. You are the author of the new book, Contemporary Left Antisemitism. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalom, our producer, and the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. You too can be a donor and have your name mentioned here on the podcast with all of the status that it entails, and also contribute to the very survival of our podcast. If you'd like to make a contribution, please write to us. Write to me, Gilad, at tlv1.fm. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive, www.tlv1.fm/podcast. There are almost 400 interviews to keep you busy, annoyed, and entertained. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dali on Twitter. She will be back with us next week. And until then, goodbye.